There's a moment. You remember it. Maybe it happened years ago. Maybe it was yesterday. But it sits in your nervous system like a fingerprint burned into glass. Someone looked you in the eye and decided they could betray you. Not because they didn't care, but because they believed you wouldn't do anything about it. They weighed your worth on a scale of reaction. And when you didn't walk, when you didn't cut the line, when you hesitated even for a second, they understood something you hadn't admitted to yourself. You were still trying to be liked. You still thought love was earned through endurance. That if you held your breath long enough, they'd finally recognize your loyalty. They didn't, because they never had to. That was the moment you lost power, not because they took it, but because you gave it away with a straight face and quiet hands. This is what they don't tell you about power. It's not built. It's remembered. It's not about becoming more. It's about stopping less. You were never weak. You were just trained to think that silence was strength, that kindness was proof of goodness, that patience would buy you safety. But they weren't confused. They saw your silence as surrender, your kindness as desperation, your patience as weakness wrapped in politeness. You weren't ignored. You were profiled. And now, you're here. Not for comfort, not for motivation, but because some part of you is ready to become untouchable, not louder, not angrier, just unavailable to manipulation, cold, clear, unbothered. You don't need another reason to respect yourself. You need a reason to never forget what happened when you didn't eat. They never told you this part. That control doesn't start with domination. It starts with detection. Noticing who feeds off your softness, who waits for your doubt, who smiles when you hesitate. They don't win because they're powerful. They win because you still want to be understood. That's the lever. Your need to be seen, to be heard, to be felt. You show your hand every time you explain your heart. You give them a map every time you defend your silence. You validate their cruelty every time you stay. This is the brutality of approval. It doesn't reward loyalty. It exploits confusion. You thought they'd appreciate your patience. They saw it as permission. You thought your vulnerability would earn connection. They turned it into a weapon. You thought empathy meant safety, but all it did was lower your guard while they sharpened their aim. And still, you wondered, maybe if I love harder, maybe if I forgive faster, maybe if I stay a little longer. Here's the part you've been avoiding. They never respected you because you never required it. The Unshakeable don't demand respect. They withdraw access. They don't confront the chaos. They become unreachable to it. No apologies, no closure, no warnings. They don't announce their exit. They just stop being useful to the wrong people. When they called you cold, you thought it meant something was wrong, but it meant they couldn't read you anymore. It meant the leash snapped. And in that moment, they had two choices: evolve, or look for another person who's still desperate to be chosen. This is the first fracture in the old you, the version that tried to earn peace by swallowing fire. You don't have to burn anymore. You don't even have to explain why you walked through the flames. They know. They just hoped you'd forget. You ever notice how they only realize your worth once you stop needing them? That's not love. That's loss of control. They don't miss you. They miss the feeling of having access to someone who didn't know their value yet. They miss the leverage, the predictability, the quiet compliance. When you were soft, they were secure. Not because you were weak, but because you still needed something from them, a label, a response, a reason. You thought love was built through honesty. They used your honesty as strategy. You thought being transparent made you trustworthy. It just made you traceable. They knew how to bait you, how to trigger you, how to spin the knife, and still act surprised when you bled. And you? You played along not because you didn't know better, but because you still thought they were like you. They're not. They study people like you. They don't speak, they observe. They don't react, they test. They don't feel bad, they adjust. But here's the moment they didn't plan for. The silence that doesn't ask for anything. The silence that doesn't check if they noticed. The silence that doesn't blink. This is where the power flips. Because now they can't read you. Now, your reactions are locked behind stillness. Now, your worth isn't in question, it's out of reach. They can't argue with silence. They can't manipulate presence. They can't seduce what doesn't need them. You don't lose power when you stop talking. You gain it. Because now, their tricks don't land. Their charm doesn't work. Their apologies feel cheap not because you're bitter, but because you see the pattern. You're not cold. You're finished. And in that moment, they feel it. That sick, hollow silence. The one they used to weaponize. Now it stares back at them. Emotionless, unreadable, sovereign. That's when they know. They didn't just lose you. They lost the version of you that tolerated them. And that version is never coming back. There's a shift. It doesn't happen when you finally scream. It doesn't happen when you get your closure. It happens when you lose interest in being understood. That's the kill switch. Because now, your identity isn't wrapped in what they think. Your confidence doesn't hinge on their reaction. Your self-respect isn't a debate. You're no longer playing to prove. You're not even playing. They'll try. They'll come back not as themselves, but as the version they think you want. Suddenly, they're reflective. Apologetics. Self-aware. They'll use the language they mocked. They'll mirror the healing you bled for. They'll perform the respect they never planned to give. And it'll sound good. That's the trap. Because the moment you respond, even with curiosity, they'll know the gate's not locked. So they'll smile. Wait. Watch. For the sigh. The softness. The crack. They don't need the whole door open. Just a hinge. Just a second of old hope. That maybe this time, but there is no this time. There's no bridge. No return. No alternate ending. Because you're not building from pain anymore. You're building from presence. Not performance. Not revenge. Just distance. Not the kind that punishes. The kind that doesn't explain. You don't ghost people like this. You just stop responding on the level they used to reach you. You don't even need to block them. You're already gone. Because the version of you they knew, the emotional echo chamber, no longer exists. They don't get to learn your new language. They forfeited that privilege when they mocked your silence and fed off your confusion. Let them sit with the old you. Let them replay the last moment they had control. And let that silence stretch. It's the most honest thing you've ever said. People think power is loud. They think it walks in with shoulders wide and words sharp. But real power? It doesn't posture. It doesn't explain. It just removes itself. Because the unshakable don't intimidate. They make themselves irrelevant to the games. You want to know the real revenge? Becoming someone who no longer needs revenge. Because once you get there, they become small. Not because they shrunk, but because you're no longer kneeling. You stood up. Not with rage. With detachment. They don't know what to do with that. When you were angry, they still had you. When you were broken, they still had your energy. But now you're still. Unshakable. Unreachable. Unwritten. And now they're the ones guessing. Playing conversations over in their head. Wondering if you ever really needed them. You didn't. You just didn't know it yet. You weren't addicted to them. You were addicted to the version of you that chased them. The overgiver. The over-apologizer. The self-blamer. You didn't want them back. You wanted the pain to make sense. You wanted the chaos to justify itself. But truth doesn't come from chaos. It comes from clarity. And clarity isn't loud. It's lethal. Because it leaves nothing to argue with. No loophole. No entry point. No oxygen. It's the part where you stop asking why. Stop looking back. Stop decoding mixed signals that were never meant to be understood, only used. You're not here to decode anymore. You're here to delete. Not them, but the part of you that waited. Waited for closure. Waited for remorse. Waited to be proven worthy by someone who was always more interested in your insecurity than your soul. That part of you has nothing left to wait for. It's over. there's a silence that hits different when it's earned. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of strategy. It's the moment after you've stopped explaining, stopped proving, stopped needing to be chosen. You're no longer accessible to confusion. You're no longer invested in being the bigger person. You're just done. And that done isn't emotional. It's surgical, precise, permanent. Because when you become untouchable, you don't seek clarity from chaos. You don't translate insults into insight. You don't fight for space in rooms that shrink when you speak truth. You just stop showing up. They'll feel it, but not the way you used to. They won't feel your absence like a tantrum. They'll feel it like a black hole, no sound, no light, no chance. You weren't loud when you gave. You're not loud when you leave. Because the unshakable don't exit the scene. They erase themselves from the script. This is what they never expected. Not that you'd argue, not that you'd cry, but that you'd become unreadable. You're no longer a character in their story. You're the silence between the lines. The one thing they can't control, can't edit, can't reach. That's power. Not the kind that demands attention. The kind that removes dependency on their love, on their reaction, on their recognition, because now you see the game for what it is. You see the patterns, the tests, the delay tactics disguised as apologies. You see how every almost was a leash. Every maybe was a muzzle. Every one day was designed to keep you stuck. And now you don't need closure. You don't need the full story. You don't even need the truth. You know, they didn't choose you because they never thought they'd lose you. They underestimated the one thing they couldn't predict. You, without emotion. You, without hunger. You, without them. And that version of you is untouchable. They'll say you changed. They'll say you got cold. They'll say you forgot who you were, but that's not the truth. The truth is, you remembered. You remembered how silence feels when it's sovereign. You remembered what your instincts sound like when they're not filtered through fear. You remembered what it means to look at someone and not need anything from them. Not love, not forgiveness, not even closure. This is the truth they can't handle. You outgrew the version of yourself that made them feel safe. Because the old you, the one who stayed after being disrespected, the one who rationalized their chaos, the one who whispered strength and shouted doubt, that version is gone. And now they can't provoke you. Because you don't explain yourself to noise. They can't charm you. Because you don't crave softness from people who only use it as bait. They can't even guilt you. Because your loyalty is no longer for sale. It's not that you don't feel. It's that your feelings aren't negotiable anymore. You don't give your peace away for tension disguised as attention. You don't lower your standards to keep company. You don't trade your instincts for intimacy because the cost is too high. And the return? Always delayed, always conditional, always empty. You learned, not through wisdom, but through war. Every conversation that left you drained. Every apology that turned into an argument. Every time you sat there holding your breath, waiting for them to choose you. That was training. You didn't build boundaries from a book. You built them from battle. And now you wear them like skin. No explanation. No negotiation. No performance. They don't like that. They call it selfish. Detached. Unreasonable. But that's how people react when their access is cut off. When the buttons don't work. When the guilt doesn't land. When the mirror doesn't reflect their control back at them. They miss the version of you who flinched. Let them. You're not here to be remembered fondly. You're here to be unavailable to disrespect. There's something they'll never admit. That they respected you more when you stopped reacting. Not when you cried. Not when you pleaded. Not when you tried to prove your side. They respected the silence. The indifference. The clean break that didn't come with an explanation. Because when you stopped trying to make them see you, they had to look at themselves. And they didn't like what they saw. That's the mirror you became. Not emotional, not vengeful, just accurate. And accuracy hurts people who build their identity on manipulation. See, they were never scared of losing you. They were scared of losing their grip on you, because when you were dependent, they were safe. When you were hopeful, they had time. But when you became still, when you became unreadable, that's when the fear set in. Not the fear of losing love, the fear of losing leverage. You weren't a person to them. You were a pattern, predictable, pliable, present. And then you vanished. Not in body, in spirit. You showed up, but different. You smiled, but guarded. You responded, but short. You stayed, but only until the room started to feel like a transaction. And then you left, without drama, without announcement, without proof, because you finally understood. Your peace doesn't need a witness. Your silence doesn't need to be translated. Your worth doesn't need to be debated. You used to want them to see your side. Now you want nothing. Not because you're angry, but because you've become clear, and clarity doesn't beg. Clarity doesn't repeat itself. Clarity doesn't fear loneliness, it fears contamination. That's the truth most people avoid. You don't lose people when you change. You lose people when you stop making exceptions. And the moment you stop bending, they break. Let them. Here's the part no one talks about. When you become untouchable, it gets quiet. Not peaceful, not at first. Empty. Still. Almost. Sterile. Because once you cut the strings, you realize how much of your life was held together by tension. How many connections were stitched with guilt. How many conversations were just rituals of control dressed up as care. There's a detox, and it's brutal. You start seeing the world as it is, not as you hoped it would be. And for a moment, that clarity doesn't feel empowering. It feels isolating, because no one warns you that becoming sovereign is a lonely path, that cutting access also cuts comfort, that when you stop being emotionally available to the wrong people, the right ones don't rush in to fill the silence. And that's when it clicks. You didn't build this mindset to attract better people. You built it to stop betraying yourself for worse ones. You didn't walk away to be chased. You walked away because staying was an insult. You didn't heal to become more lovable. You healed to become less leavable by you. That's what untouchable means. Not immune to pain. Immune to persuasion. They can cry. They can beg. They can remember all the things they used to ignore. It won't work, because this version of you, the one that stopped hoping, stopped explaining, stopped leaking love into voids, this version isn't a phase. It's a threshold. And once you cross it, there's no returning to the emotional ecosystem where they once ruled. Let them scream into the silence. Let them perform apologies you'll never hear. Let them become obsessed with the door they thought you'd never close. It doesn't matter. You're not just gone. You're untouchable. Now you walk differently. Not with swagger, not with arrogance, but with absence. You're no longer in the room the way you used to be. No longer scanning for approval. No longer adjusting your tone to seem less much. No longer trading your presence for peace. You are there, but you are not available. And that shift? They feel it. Long before they admit it. They notice how your eyes don't flinch. How your voice stays calm when theirs climbs. How your silence doesn't ask for anything back. You've become a mirror they can't manipulate. And in that reflection, they see it clearly now. They never had your heart. They had your hunger. The hunger to be seen. The hunger to be enough. The hunger to finally feel safe. But that hunger is gone. Starved to death by repeated betrayals dressed as almost. Buried beneath every time you lowered your standard just to keep the peace. Now you don't need peace. You are the peace. And anything that threatens it loses you. No conversation. No fight. No back and forth. You just exit the level. That's the part they'll never understand because they never had to. They never had to rebuild their identity from the wreckage of false promises. They never had to sit in the silence of realizing they were used. They never had to question if their kindness was care or codependency. But you did. And now, you know the answer. You are the answer. And that's why they hate your silence now. Not because it hurts, but because it's final. The old you would have come back, would have explained, would have softened. But the old you was built on fear. This you is built on choice. And that choice has consequences. Not for you. For them, because now they know. They didn't just lose access. They lost the only version of you who ever tolerated being touched without being held. And that version will never speak their name again. They say time heals. It doesn't. Time just reveals what was always true once you stop lying to yourself. You look back now, not with nostalgia, but with precision. Every red flag you ignored, every pause in your gut you called paranoia, every apology you accepted because you couldn't stomach the silence. But now you can. You can stomach it, sit in it, own it, because silence isn't empty anymore. It's evidence. Evidence that you don't chase chaos just to feel alive. Evidence that you no longer fear being misunderstood. Evidence that you no longer mistake attention for affection. That's the evolution. You used to explain yourself in circles just to avoid abandonment. Now you let them walk. Because if your presence wasn't enough, your explanation never would be. And that truth, it's not sad, it's sacred. Because when you become untouchable, you don't attract the people who want to possess you. You attract the ones who can't be shaken by your boundaries. The ones who don't flinch when you say no. The ones who meet you in the silence not to fill it, but to honor it. But even then, you're not waiting. You're not reaching. You're not hoping. You're just here. Whole. Clear. Unwritten by anything but your own restraint. This is the final war. Not with them. With the parts of you that thought survival required surrender. You surrendered too many times. To their confusion. To their comfort. To their cowardice. But not anymore. Now your distance is discipline. Your detachment is devotion. Your silence is strategy. You're no longer warm to the wrong people. No longer soft for those who sharpen knives with compliments. No longer open to energies that treat you like a transaction. You've become the version of yourself that can no longer be provoked. Because you don't rise to bait. You rise above it. That's what makes you dangerous. Not your darkness. Your discipline. Not your edge. Your emotional silence. Not your rage. Your restraint. And now, they can project. They can provoke. They can perform. But they can't touch you. Because you don't live in the world where their words matter anymore. You live where their access ends.